Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you, Rabbi Beasley, for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. Can you share a bit about your background and what inspired you to write Joel, Obadiah, Micah, Facing the Storm as part of the esteemed Maggid Studies on Tanakh series?
So this is my second book in the Maggid series. And first of all, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed listening to the podcast and interacting with the two of you. I'm the Tanakh coordinator at Levi Torah, which means I do most of the Tanakh classes there and plan the curriculum. What are the goals for what should every yeshiva student know about Tanakh? And my own personal background is both literally and figuratively rather unorthodox. I grew up in a small town in Canada, very much a boondocks at the time. Now it's just been subsumed by the Greater Toronto Authority, but it used to be a very small town. And eventually made my way to the Jewish day school, the Community Academy of Toronto, went to Yeshiva University, and I had the fortune or misfortune of getting put into a very bad Gemara shir. I don't know if you've ever had that experience.
Oh yeah.
And my choice was that, okay, I can't, this is not working, and that's fairness. I don't want to say who or when, but let me go to one of the other programs. And then I just said, okay, I can major and start taking Tanakh. I took a Gemara shir, but I took 7 classes of Tanakh weekly. And that just opened my eyes to a brand new, this is everybody was just take a couple courses, graduate, but Tanakh became a love and a passion. And in 93, my wife and I made Aliyah to Mivaseret, to the Merit School, and I started teaching in Shari Mivaseret as well for a bit in the afternoons, doing Tanakh, and slowly became exposed to what you call the Gush Tanakh Method. At that time, it was only Rabbi Lead Tag online, just sharing his little unformatted Word documents, but you start to appreciate the beauty of seeing a structure, a message that comes out of the structure. My wife had her own connection with Gush. She had worked as a volunteer in the mid-'80s, and her goal was not to make it to Israel. Her goal was to move to the Gush. So in 96, we moved to the Gush, and I found myself with Rabbi Lead Tag 2 houses down the street, and the yeshiva across the street, and all these wonderful thinkers, and they've helped me develop my thinking, and where I agree, where I disagree, but this became really my passion for the past 30 years. Presently, I'm teaching in Levi Torah Tanakh. When it comes to the Treyasar, my kids have ordered me a hat that I was supposed to wear today. It didn't arrive yet, with a nice big MAGA hat, make Treyasar great again. That's become my motto. I've got this. My first work actually was the Torah Mi'etzion series. This was actually, I had mentioned to Rabbi Reuven Ziegler, who is now the head of Maggid Publishing, that what we need is a commentary on the Tanakh using all the things that have been written by Har Etzion, its teachers, its affiliates. And he thought it was an interesting idea. He went to Rabbi Bick, and we hashed out this. You have to introduce the world to what Gush Tanakh is, and the Torah Metzion series. I don't know if you reviewers have it. I just have a copy here. The famous blue binding essays, 4 or 5 essays in every parsha, describe approaching the Torah portion from what would be the Gush view. Gush thinkers, Gush approach, and trying to demonstrate how this works. In the meantime, I was working, at the time I finished my master's in Bar Ilan in Tanakh, and I was working towards a doctorate while trying to do 2 full-time jobs, which really didn't work out well as far as but I was looking for a topic, and I the advice I got was go to the library and see which books have the smallest amount of writers on the shelf, so you're not competing with anybody. And all of a sudden you've got all, full bookcases on Isaiah and Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel, and then you get to Treyasar. And Treyasar, you'll have 2 shelves full. Everybody loves Hosea. Hosea is a very exciting Navi. Amos, social justice. Let justice roll down like a mighty stream. These are exciting. And then you get this one shelf with Micah had this much and Nahum had this much. And I said, that's where I'm going to focus. And from there, I threw myself into the smaller and less studied books of the Treyasar. And when Rabbi Ziegler gave me the opportunity first to write about Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah, I jumped at it and worked through it. And it was fun. When you're only working with 4 or 5 books in, I'll just give Nahum as an example. On the Bar Ilan shelf, this is a university academic shelf, there are only 5 books on Nahum. And 2 of which were by feminist scholars who were using their books to vent about Nahum's portrayal of Nineveh as a woman who is a loose woman who is going to be humiliated. Chapter 3 of Nahum describes that Nineveh will be open like a prostitute's skirt. It's a very powerful image, and it's also very degrading to women. I understand that. 2 books were written by Catholic scholars who were very upset that Nahum's in the Tanakh because God is supposed to be love, and what sort of loving God would allow the destruction of a city, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the only literary read was a feminist Catholic nun who had written this great literary read. So there's really nothing, combining both of the world of the things that I was complaining about, but she actually had read the text, and it was very lonely because what are you working on? Nahum. Nobody had anything to contribute. It was very depressing. And these are books that don't appear in the liturgy. Nahum is actually a haftorah in the triennial cycle. I'll let you guess. It's a book about vengeance. So what parsha would be great to put Nahum as a haftorah in? If you had to pick up a parsha that said, I want a haftorah about vengeance. We don't use the word vengeance too much in our religious world.
That's a good question. It is a great question.
If you had to, so I'll put you out of your misery. Shimon and Levi going into Shem after Dinah.
Okay, fine.
And in the original 3-year cycle,
you realize how simple it was, but you can't get it when you're asked.
When it's
right, but nobody thinks.
It's like asking a comedian to tell a joke on the spot.
But we don't think that. But that in itself is a commentary how they viewed the actions of Shimon and Levi.
Yeah,
which is very interesting. They weren't bothered by the sense, oh, vengeance is bad, although it describes El Nokem V'Noter, God, it's a play on the 13 mitzvot of Rachamim. Nahum, God is vengeful, God holds grudges, God is coming after you. Very different view of the God that we teach, and Nahum doesn't make it into the liturgy. And now the first book was released actually beginning of January, and I was fortunate to get the copy. I was visiting my mother. My mother, husband at the time, was sick. We'd come to visit him in North America, and we got a copy of the book, went back to London, went to the British Museum. For those who don't know, the British Museum contains Nineveh. In one of the rooms, you can find the throne room of Sancherib himself. So I got to read the book and read Nahum in Sancherib's throne room. To me, that was a wonderful closing of the circle.
Amazing.
And then COVID hit, so the book sort of fell off the shelves as with everything else. So the new book has come out, Yoel, Ovadiah, and Micah, and it's gotten a nice reception. I'm very appreciative, and hopefully it adds to the discussion. As you, Ben, I think you mentioned you went to a shir on Ovadiah today, or on Shabbat.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we just started it, and
I've tried to limit it to 60 pages, which some people say, how do you write 60 pages on a 21 verse book? But we'll talk about that when we get to Obadiah.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, when you mentioned earlier that it was like a kind of an idea that you came up with, hey, we should put this Torah Metzion out into the world, teach the the method to the world, I was just like, that must have been, first of all, it's the best decision obviously you've all made, because right now we see it's extremely popular. All the Maggid series is extremely popular. You see it in all the farm stores.
All over.
It's all over the place, and
All
it's such an amazing phenomenon. But I want to ask you personally, what, you studied in college and then you ended up in the Gush, but was there like a moment where you just like you learned this and you're like blown away? Was it love at first sight, or was it something that like you struggled with at first? Like, what is this? Or was it something that like was, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable? Like, what was your first reaction to the method?
I have a close friend of mine, Rabbi Michael Citron. He's the director at Leva Torah. And several years ago, he wasn't feeling well, and I bought him a book. He said, I need something new to read on Parsha. And I brought him Elchanan Salmon's first set.
Mm-hmm.
And he said something very interesting. He read it. He'd never seen this style before. He was always used to the traditional, open up the Mikra Gedolot. What Nechama did best, when we talk about,
Mm-hmm.
we always have to talk about what came before to appreciate the revolutionary nature. The traditional approach is to open a pasuk, read a verse, read the commentaries. And his response was, this is such a democratic approach. Meaning, I don't need to go through layers and centuries of interpretation to understand what the verse is doing, what the text is doing. I just have to read the text. Of course, that doesn't mean he could write or I could write a book like Rav Samet after one read of the chapter, but you start to see that's an approach I can apply. That's an approach that's very accessible. And when you tell students what is the key word, for example, one of the classic literary tools, interesting, first appear, and this becomes one of these little great questions as a side note, the first one to use the Leitfort, the word was Buber and Rosenzweig. But if you ask a Rav Yoel ben Nun, this is obviously what Chazal meant when they were going through the text. Many of the Gush Rebbeim are very, very adamant. What we're doing is not anything revolutionary. There's a stream. We're just applying traditional midrashic tools to the text and just developing them further. Whereas I like to say those of us who are more exposed, Rav Yoel hasn't studied academic literary biblical criticism, and that's not to his detriment at all. Those of us who have studied it realize, well, this was found elsewhere, or at least applied elsewhere as a way for arriving at the shot of a text. But it wasn't one thing that I read. I spent a year reading Rabbi Liebtag, who became, for many people, the first voice of the Gush methodology, way back in the 90s. And then slowly the virtual based medrash started to make it more accessible. And listening to, for several years, I sat next to Rabbi Yonatan Grossman in Shul until I realized that it was great discussions, but I shouldn't be having those discussions in Shul. So I had to move forward. I put myself literally in the seat right in front of Rabbi Rimon because I couldn't keep talking in Shul. It was a Rosh Hashanah decision. I have to stop talking in Shul. And even if we're talking about, different methodologies, you can't really do that in the middle of Shmona Esrei. So it's still very tempting.
I just want to.
However, go please.
No, you were saying how you don't need to have like the gamut of traditional, the traditional commentaries in order to get into this method. It's very text based. You can just dive right in, as long as you're faithful to the text. My father, he grew up without. He never learned he didn't have that when he was younger. He went to a regular tichon in Israel, and he learned Tanakh, just Tanakh. You know what I mean? He knew Rashi a little bit, never knew exactly what to do with Rashi, really, but meaning he didn't, because Rashi would sometimes say things that would, for him, he didn't know exactly where to go with some of that stuff. But he knows Tanakh very well. He learned all of Tanakh, and he knows it fluently. And then I introduced him during COVID, actually, because there was a lot of time, and and I started taking walks with my dad.
Are we starting to get oh, I wish we were back in COVID. I was
No,
reading
no,
so
no,
much.
sure, but we used to take walks together. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but yeah, we were taking walks together.
It's understood. 6 feet apart, masks.
And I was basically going through Torah Metzion. We were going through different things. There's different books right now off the top of my head. I don't remember. I was going through it. My dad got very into it. He loved it. Today, and I'm not exaggerating, he like is on a hunt for any possible he's finished everything from Yaakov Medan on YouTube, anything from Elchanan Yoel bin Nun, Amnon Bazak. He goes through it all. And when you said that, that's exactly the point, because my dad, even though he doesn't have all the traditional knowledge, the very fact that he knows Tanakh well, he's able to just dive into this and fully appreciate it, because he can jump right in. You get what I'm saying? I'm just trying to bounce off what you said, how it's available.
But we realize this is perhaps one of the critiques of the method, right? And this is precisely the critique.
Although I would also say
I'm worried we're creating a bunch of Artsim who don't know Rambans, who don't know Sfornos, on one hand. And I would say that once we skip Chazal, the whole discussion of Tanakh B'Govenaim, how do I approach the biblical characters? You mentioned earlier, like, who is Obadiah? Who is Esav in the text? In the biblical text, Esav's not such a bad guy. He's not great. He marries 2 wives who are Kanani in Sefer Breshit. That's not a good thing. He then leaves the land. The two things that the two-part, we'll give a little 10-second background. There are 2 Brits that Hashem makes with Abraham. Mm-hmm. One is Brit Milah, and one is Brit Haaretz. Yep. And the 2 things that Esav does wrong is he violates Brit Milah by marrying Knanim, and he violates Brit Haaretz by willingly leaving the land in chapter 36. So he's not a hero, but he's not the bad guy that Chazal make him out to be. Who, when he's coming back and he's tired because he's murdering and raping and blaspheming and and all these, and you wonder where that midrash comes from. But on the other hand, then it becomes the humanization of the biblical characters becomes the challenging point for those who view biblical characters as where's the role model then? Mm-hmm. And it's that balance that the democratic nature is precisely what leads to the challenges that the methodology faces.
Correct. I would say, though, that most of the time, in most of the writings, Chazal is mentioned throughout the Gush works. Commentaries are constantly analyzed. It's not like it's completely left alone.
No.
It's not. That's not. Yeah, but in another way also, I think that through the Gush, and I would like for you to elaborate on how you understand this. But for me, I think that we can also come from the opposite direction. When you jump into Chazal without any pretext, when you just jump into it and it becomes, let's say, just everything is taken literally or face value, and there's no omek into understanding Chazal, that also is a problem, though.
That's the Rambam in the beginning of
right. So it's a double-edged sword here,
right? The first group, the Hakata Miskena. I'm not an expert in Rambam Perek Chelek. The rabbi quoted it yesterday, and he handed us source sheets, and I just read it. Okay, that say that they are being meromem Chazal by taking them literally, and they are mashpilotam, by look at how foolish we appear because we take Chazal literally. It's such beautiful wording, worth looking up. But he talks about the first group of people don't understand how to approach Chazal. There are people who take Chazal literally and say it's ridiculous, and there are people who take Chazal literally and say we can't question this. This is obviously what happens, and that's not what. So there, I get, but I think what's different between, say, when a Gush person approaches Tanakh, he's not looking at Mikra Gedolot first.
Correct. Yes.
And that makes a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
That enables him to find patterns, structures, repeating words. I just opened up for fun. I wanted to, just have the Mikra Gedolot of the first verse of Yoshua here. There's 2 lines here, and everything else is commentary. You're not going to see what the repeating word in Yoshua 1 is. The first chapter of Yoshua is, you're not going to see the patterns and how the text is structured if you're only reading one sentence at a time and interrupting it for a page, 2 pages of commentary. On the other hand, solely reading a Tanakh is going to lead to the opposite problem. So you have to finding where do I go first is that's the question. What book am I using? And whoever controls the books I'm using, there's an interesting article in Tradition when talking about the Torah Chaim that was put out by Moshe Rav Kook. Which Mefarshim go on the page? All of a sudden, if I lose the Kli Yakar and I lose the Or Chaim, what have I lost? What have I gained? And what does that say about what I understand the message of Tanakh to be? So,
So I want to give our audience a little inside information how we met. You reached out to us, and before we get into your book, because that's going to be the second part of this podcast, we wanted to just tell everybody how we met. You emailed us after listening to our episode with JJ Kimche on the Gush Tanakh Method, and while you expressed that you enjoyed the discussion, you wanted to respond to some of his positions. And could you first tell our audience who maybe didn't listen to that episode or are not familiar, what exactly is the Gush Tanakh Method?
Okay, so let's start with an example, okay? I'm going to start with a story that begins, that I think most people, I hope, are familiar with, and that's the story of the spies going to Yoshua Bet. Is the spies going to Rachav in Jericho. So you can read that text and look for, okay, why are they going here and what is happening at each stage? And if you go line by line, commentary, you'll get a picture of a story. The Gush method would look and say, okay, what words repeat themselves? Not too many here, but then I say, where have I seen these verses before? Okay, so on one hand, it's democratic, but obviously if you have a sense of the more Tanakh that you have under your belt, the easier it is to make these connections and parallels. So Rachav's speech is lifted word for word out of Devarim, this last week's parsha and this week's parsha, where she talks about the greatness of God, B'shmaim al v'aretz mitachat, very flowery words for a 13th century prostitute in Jericho. Okay, and that I'll leave that as a separate question. And then you say, where have I seen this story before?
I'm very bad with Haftorahs. Very bad with Haftorahs.
Malbim immediately jumps and says, this is the Haftorah for Shalach, sending spies to the land of Israel.
Right.
And he begins, this is why, you can safely say this approach is done by others. Here's what Moshe did, and here's what Yoshua did. And here are 5 differences. Yoshua doesn't tell the entire people. He doesn't send heads of the nation. They report to him directly. They don't report to the entire people. I would add one final caveat. Moshe's spies were great spies. They got all the information they needed. Their conclusion was wrong. Rachav's spies are Keystone cops. They're bumbling. They're nearly caught. They're, they're really, and yet they come back with the opposite conclusion. Oh, we're going to win this. We have no need to worry. It's a very interesting little switch in the story. Mm-hmm. So I've read that story many times. And a couple of years ago, I came with another set of parallels. 2 people who are sent by a force that's going to destroy a city, take refuge in a house. A mob surrounds the house, or people surround the house. And close.
Lot, meaning the
Lot.
Yeah.
I think this is a reversal of the Lot story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that would be the Gush method, to look and say, okay, and then you look and say, okay, if the themes are the same, what wording is the same? And you find a set of verbal parallels along the way. I'll let you do your homework. We don't have to, okay, which parallels match up, including a little wordplay that I happen to love, though, which is the 2 people go to Rachav, and the 2 angels before they go to Lot, they go to Rechov Ha'ir. So if you hear the little play there, it's a fun little And then the question, of course, you have to ask, and sometimes I think this is a legitimate criticism of the Gush method, what is the point of these parallels? And why is Sodom destroyed? If you look in the text, in the biblical text, why is Sodom destroyed?
Their sinful nature towards
they're evil.
Define sinful. What is the sin that was the only sin we can see in? There are several sins we see, but what sin is the one that's being highlighted?
The way they're abusing Lot's daughters.
Even before they offered, Lodenfeld makes that strange offer, which is a separate, discussion, but they don't take guests in.
Oh,
Nahum.
yeah.
Yep.
They don't take guests in, and that is contrast with Avraham, who in the previous chapter is taking guests in. And then, of course, if you're a Gush guy, you're looking and saying, here's the words in the story. Here's the parallels to the Lot story, and you playing interpreting itself. Rachav gets saved.
She invited.
Because she takes guests in.
Yeah, she invited them.
And I would add to something perhaps a little bit dramatic, but she's a Kanani. But that tells us the Canaanim not being destroyed for any national reasons or biological reasons. There's a moral issue. If a Canaani who can take guests in Midrashic terms, gets to marry Yoshua, as the Midrash will say at the end of the chapter 6. This is an amazing thing. But I was to give that an example of how the Gush Tanakh method works. A Tanakh Mefresh et Atzmo. I find words, or I find a story, I've matched it up with other stories. I find lines, I match them up with other, and you're creating this huge intertextual web. That's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to be playful. You can look, sometimes how the strands may be very tenuous, and this is part of the discussion that still has to be had. What are the rules to these parallels? What are the rules to, is this what the author really intended? It's hard to say the author, but is the text telling me, look back at the story? I think in the Rachav and the Lot story, it does. Sometimes you have others, that may be less convincing, but we're looking at the text as a whole and trying to see what the text as a whole say.
So it's assuming a unity to the text.
Correct.
Like, not only is it assuming, it's displaying the unity in the text. In a sense, it's displaying it. It's putting it out there.
So I've been working with Rabbi Asher Manning the past month on an article for Rav Yoel Ben's 75th birthday, his Feshrive, trying to explain his methodology in English. And it discusses two approaches to biblical criticism, higher source criticism. And in Gush, you had Rabbi Breuer, who was famous for he accepted the fundamentals. There are different documents that Kadosh Baruch Hu built the Torah as different documents, and wants to contrast different ideas with each other, accepting at least the basis of the source criticism, because as he says, as opposed to four authors, Hashem is the author, and we have to understand why he does this. And Rav Yoel's approach is exactly what you said. When you see enough of these larger patterns, it creates a larger picture. Okay, so this piece in and of itself may not fit, but if I see it in a larger picture, there's a unity that's created that many of the questions, Rav Yoel would say all of them, but many of the questions for sure start to disappear.
We had Rabbi David Foreman on a while back, and we had a whole segment just dedicated to this way of responding to biblical source criticism, which I thought was very effective. And it's precisely what you're saying right now. There's so much, it's like overwhelming the evidence that it's so difficult to make the argument. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
I personally agree with you. I know that in talking to academics who hold by the source critical theory, they don't deny that there's a level of intertextuality that is taking place throughout the text, or a structure. They just feel that the different wordings, for the large part, I remember James Kugel told me several years ago, he was actually one of my two mentors on my master's thesis in Bar Ilan, and he said to me, honestly, there are really only two documents: the P document and everything else. Okay, that in academia, many of the distinctions between the J, E, D, and I hope nobody's offended by me explaining what they think, have fallen away because of it. But the P document remains a very specific, and to me, as a religious Jew, that makes sense. If anybody who's ever read any document or contract they've signed for a rental agreement knows that the English in a legal contract is not the same as day-to-day conversational English or even prose. The fact that the Torah will use a different terminology for legal terms doesn't bother me so much as it does, as others would say, here's my proof.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this comes down to the question of what are my assumptions going into the text. I acknowledge I have my biases, and I'm not embarrassed of them. And those people who are academic have to acknowledge they're coming with an assumption of what the text is. If you view it as a man-made document over hundreds of years, you'll find cracks. And if you view it as what appear to be cracks, if you use a divine document, those will disappear. I want to be fair to both sides, but I do see a larger overarching unity to the text that's there.
And it's not just even about you. I mean, unity is the obvious points that you can bring out, but what's more interesting and where it gets more it's harder but also more enriching is when we understand that not only is there unity through the text being shown here, but the text is speaking to each other. The texts are in conversation. It's
that's the fun part.
That's the enriching part, and that's the part where I feel like a lot of people they appreciate the Gush method because it shows the unity of the text, but I don't think people realize how enriching actually getting into it and seeing the conversation that's going on here in the text and what it could really mean towards what's actually being written.
And also the difficulty of taking separate documents and combining them and still having a coherent message it's very difficult to grasp that for me.
I sympathize. Yeah, to me, they're not different documents; they're one document. But what you said about the conversation, it took 20 years for somebody taught me the first basic skill of understanding Tosfot on the Gemara. I just wanted to bring this as this. I'll come back to the Tanakh in a second, which is when Tosfot takes a text from. Okay, what did I just study? Okay, the first Mishnah in the 10th chapter in Pesachim. You cannot eat before the Seder.
Mm-hmm.
Then Tosfot comes to the Gemara on Kuf Zayin and says you can eat Mine Targuma, you can eat these different foods. So the question is, do I explain this text in terms of this text, or which text is primary and which text is? Tosfot always says this text is the one that's correct, and this text has to be reinterpreted.
Correct. To make it fit to the other text.
Right. A or B. But the implicit understanding you have to ask yourself, which text does Tosfot hold to be? This is the text that I'm not going to change. This is the text I'm going to. You talk about conversations. In the first Torah Me'etzion, there are two articles on Noach getting drunk.
I've read them.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Rabbi Chanoch Waxman wrote a brilliant article comparing Noach getting drunk to Lot getting drunk with his daughters. And I wrote an article on Noach getting drunk compared to Gan Eden. That every step that Noach is taking is parallel to what Adam Rishon is supposed to be doing in the Garden of Eden. So the question is, depending on the story I pick, is Noach just getting drunk to avoid it all, just like Lot is post-trauma, really destruction, the destruction of Sodom, the destruction of his whole world, and there's nothing left, and he's getting drunk to avoid that? Or is he doing what he's doing to try to recreate, the Garden of Eden after the world has? Is he starting anew, or is he trying to hide? So picking the story that I apply it to becomes very fascinating, because then it becomes a interpretive choice. It's not just two stories, but there's this whole web going back and forth Um, one of my next works is a book on the Tanakh web. I'm just trying to create one of these. Remember how when we were kids we used to have these choose your own adventure stories?
Of course, I used to love those.
So
Seriously.
I'd like to create a thing. Okay, you're at the Akedah. If you want to see how the Akedah plays out in the covenant after Matan Torah in chapter 24, go to this page. If you want to see the Akedah has echoes in something very different, the concubine at Givah, the horrible story of the Pelegish of Givah in chapter 19, but there's all sorts of literary parallels there as well. Go to this page. And the story that I choose will influence how I understand what's happening in the Akedah. So conversations are two ways, and people forget that. And if I read A and B, that's going to influence my understanding of A. It's a challenging question. It's fun though. This is part of what the fun, and the enjoyment of learning is, at least in the Gush way. So
it's truly amazing. And regarding some of Kimche's criticisms.
Okay. So if memory serves right, he had several. He brought a very interesting criticism. I accept, and I get stuck with a so what. I'll explain what the criticism is, that we can't put ourselves into the
time period.
We claim to be trying to understand Pshat. What is the meaning of the text? But meaning is time dependent and values dependent. And this, we can't understand what it means. If a king has a total control over a subject who says, go charge, and everybody goes and charges, well, who's responsible for the damage they cause? And, whereas we nowadays hold individual soldiers responsible for, what would be war crimes. If somebody was committed an atrocity, they have to be held responsible. That's not I don't think anybody would question that. But in ancient times, I don't think that would apply, because the idea of even disobeying a king would be it wouldn't be done. It just is so far. I think he brings that example in his article that writes about it. And the reality is, the problem it's correct, and then so what? I don't mean to be dismissive, because that's not the critique that caused me to lose sleep. There's one critique he had. There are three critiques. I'm going to do the first two that didn't cause me to lose any sleep. The critique was, that we can't fully appreciate what it means. And that's true. But that's why the Maggid Mishnah says in Hilchot Shchenim, the Torah, because the Torah is nitzchit, it doesn't try to answer every question at every time, but it allows for the variations in human interactions, and because the ultimate values are eternal. So I recognize that, at various points I can't fully appreciate the text.
I mean,
the second one was
if we're going with the premise that it's a divine text, with that premise, of course, if not, that's a whole different story. But with the premise of a divine text, meaning becomes, to square into
Good.
one meaning is not.
Good.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a great question, and I'll tell you where it comes up, and especially very relevant to our lives nowadays. How do we wage war morally? Okay. If we were to go by what's described in the Bible, then we should be doing a lot more to the Palestinians, and that is inherently moral.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's issues like this, where already we see. I like the Rambam's explanation of Shemitah. How can you nullify a biblical mitzvah? And principle specifically, how can you nullify a biblical mitzvah? Give Chazal the right to override, a biblical mitzvah. And the Rambam in the Guide to Perplex, and you see it elsewhere with says, because the values are eternal, how we apply these values has to be established by time base. I would not want to apply the biblical standards of morality to modern warfare nowadays. I don't think we should. I don't think it's right. I think it's wrong. The Rambam describes a process where korbanot was the appropriate approach. But the Torah tries to move us and wean us away from it. And one could argue very simply, slavery. How does the Bible have slavery? Because everybody has slavery, and slavery is a universal institution, and but the Bible makes very clear it doesn't like slavery. The Bible makes it very clear it doesn't like marrying two wives. There's nobody marries two wives, gets off. Nothing good happens to them. Okay, two mother-in-laws cannot be better than one.
It spends a good deal of time. It spends a good deal of time with Rachel and Leah outlining that. I mean, it's not even. The Torah very, very adamant about. Yeah, direct about it. Even
Shmuel, Penina, and Hannah. You can go through everybody who's married.
Yeah,
and this becomes the Tanakh, and the Rambam builds this very nuanced and subtle idea, but I think it's the correct understanding of the text. I can't outlaw everything, but I can set up the values. I don't like slavery. I don't like polygamy. I don't like, and notice already, you see that in Chazal, there was no such thing as a ben Sora Mora. There was no such thing as Ira Hanidachat.
Right.
And already there's this sense that we
avoiding the death penalty as much as possible.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's saying that I'm not, and it doesn't detract from the divine text. It just says how it's applied has to be regulated and moderated. And this is why we have Chazal, and this is why we have these discussions throughout our commentators. And so I think so it is a divine text without question, because it contains divine values that are eternal. Values don't change. How they're applied on a day-to-day basis. For this, we have rabbinical guidance and a tradition of thousands of years. That would be my response to what you were saying.
Excellent.
Yep. And which criticism of Kimche did make you lose sleep?
So the second criticism was the academic. Kimche says, you're cherry picking from the academics. You accept some of their findings, but you don't accept their conclusions. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't think that's intellectually dishonest. Because the academics come in with a foundational set of, here's what we believe to be true about the text or whatever we are doing, and then they interpret what they find accordingly. Now, those findings are findings, and what they find in archaeology, I have to deal with, but I don't necessarily have to accept their understanding. I don't believe the Exodus happened, and therefore this is what archaeology teaches. But I can look and say, okay, I do have this interesting discovery here at Kayaba, which shows that, wait a second, there's no pig bones anywhere in this area, and the good gates are facing Jerusalem. There's a double gate. And could that be the Shari mentioned in Shmuel? And I'm not bound by their intellectual, their assumptions. That doesn't bother me. The one that bothered me was the Zohar.
Because they're bringing their own bias to the text.
Right. Since they're bringing their own bias to the text.
Why is that? That's exactly what, okay. Yeah.
Okay. The one that did bother me was a fascinating one, because I'll tell you where it came from. He says, what is the purpose of studying text in general? What is the purpose of studying text? And the Zohar, he brought the Zohar quoted by Rav Moshe Lichtenstein in the Hisichati, that the pshat is the garment, but getting close to Kadosh Baruch Hu is the meaning of the text. Is the purpose. I don't know if you remember, this is a sort of this, he threw it out, it's not the purpose. And because the Gush Derech is so concentrated on the structure and the pshat and understanding what are the rules of the text, understanding itself, where's the meaning to it? Right. And I don't know if he was aware of it. He was echoing the criticism of Rabbi Francis Nataf in Jewish Action several years ago when the Torah Me'etzion study finished. And he put a criticism into Jewish Action. And I remember this bothering me no end. Of course, I'm biased. I view the Torah Mitzvah series as as my baby. Okay. And obviously many other people, great people, worked on the project, did much more than I did to develop it, but I have a love for this series. And he said it teaches structure, it shows patterns, it's great, but it's too sophisticated, and there's nobody's trying to. What is the meaning? What is the purpose? Meaning,
what may I just?
And that's, and
I'm
it
just trying
comes.
to understand something. I'm just trying to understand something. There's enormous amount of meaning that's brought out from these structures all over. We read Torah Metzion, it's like infinite amount of meanings that is brought out from the structures. What do we mean here by no meaning?
Well, I think he was, if I recall correctly, I haven't listened to that podcast in a long time, but I think the point that he referenced was, for example, like Esav's the descendants of Esav, that whole section. Like what is the purpose of mention? Right? Was that what he mentioned?
Correct. I would say it a little differently. It's very hard to take a Torah Metzion essay and make an inspiring 2-minute vort at the Shabbos table.
Okay.
Which is and this comes into a lot of the questions that we ask in yeshiva. Am I teaching the text? Am I teaching, or am I, I don't think the dichotomy is true, or am I teaching values or goals? If that makes there's a sense of many of the courses that many yeshiva offer, I would call yeshiva TED Talks, where they take a verse and then they run and jump or an idea, and they develop that idea. If you look at the most best-selling books in the Jewish world, okay, the Musar books, nobody opens up a Nahum. We'll come back to Nahum soon. Nobody opens a Nahum for Musar. The best-selling books are the ones that tell me what I need to do right now, tell me what I need to think, tell me what I need, what are the midot I need to have, what are the hashkafa.
You can't get a vort with like a punchline, right?
It's very hard. What is it? What is it? And that becomes. So as I said, it kept me up because it really did bother me, because there is a truth to that. Guys don't come to my class to be inspired. Mm-hmm. I try to inspire. I try to be, but they don't. The purpose of the class is to actually learn something, and I don't like creating this artificial dichotomy. But look at the shelves of. If you go into yeshiva and you look at the books that the kids put on their makom, they don't have Tanakh. So they will have, if you get a fancy title, the Magic Touch, remember that book on Negiah from so many years ago, right? Yeah. Great book, great marketing. And I'm not against Hilchot, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but you see how that is marketed. My favorite always is Eric Fromm, the former student of Rav Dessler, took Kuntres Chesed and turned it into this great psychological bestseller, The Art of Loving. Mm-hmm. And I always wanted to do that, say the Chafetz Chaim, The Art of Not Speaking Gossip and, destroy and defaming your neighbors, or finding a good title. But that's 90% of our Jewish bookshelf. And I think there's a reason for that. People are looking first for inspiration to stay connected, to stay attached. And to what extent does the Gush methodology advance that? I'll tell you, a lot of the problem is that people in Gush, they live in Israel. They read the Tanakh, they look outside the window. Yeah, I'm inspired. For people who are removed from that milieu, it's not as exciting. You don't walk around Teaneck, New Jersey with a Tanakh in hand and recreate the steps of the ancestors. It's a very different, and so they don't have the sense that this is a living document as much as it would be otherwise. It's not a 2-minute vort at the Shabbos table. So that did bother me. And I thought about it some more. Let me ask you a question. How would you define Torah Lishma?
Uh, the great debate over the years.
Between Reb Chaim of Volozhin and
Torah
the
Lishma, I would say would be the Rosh. The Rosh had the Rosh had L'Shem Torah, I believe that's from the Rosh. No,
right.
Chaim Volozhin gives, right. Then you have the Hasidic view. If you were to ask me just like this on one foot, I would say just the most basic level, Torah Lishma should mean trying to understand the Torah for the sake of what the Torah has to say.
So you're siding with the Rosh, the Chaim Volozhin.
In a sense.
I think to a large extent, the Jewish world has sided with Rosh Ner Zalman, the first Lubavitch Rebbe, who says Torah Lishma is whatever gets you close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Yeah, but okay, yeah.
Okay, which is essentially Torah Lishma, Torah for the purpose
of... Yeah.
And that's, we see it in the spirituality. I teach in an Israeli high school as well as Leva Torah. And who wants to study Tanakh when, you know, you've got Rabbi Nachman stories that are all the rage and very quick spiritual fixes and, you know, highs. And this becomes again, so this is what JJ Kimche's critique, you know, all these thoughts came back when I heard this, because the Gush method does not lend itself to easy vorts. I will accept that and own that. It sides with the Rosh, the Chaim Volozhin. We're here to try to understand what the Torah is saying, and it's a much more arduous and strenuous process than it appears. You have to sit down and read it and appreciate the nuances. It doesn't lend itself to quick fixes, which I think a lot of the religious world and the modern world is trying to always find today. So,
right. But that's a modern phenomenon. You know, the need for inspiration for when it comes to like these giving these vorts, but I don't think that's not really a valid critique on, you know, historically, like what would be wrong? Why would that cause you not to sleep well at night? Like what exactly is bothersome about that? That's the part I don't understand.
Because every time that I go in and teach students, I have a responsibility to them, both to give over information and to inspire them so that 20 years from now, they will hopefully be able to, you know, pass this on to their children. And that becomes...
May I say something?
What?
May I say something?
Please.
When I'm being totally upfront over here. When I was younger, I learned a lot of Hasidut. A lot. Too much. Okay? A lot. And I got inspired a lot. Like it was like a tidal wave of inspiration. At one point I stopped. There was a part of me that was sort of I guess inside it was like, well, where am I going to get inspiration from right now if I'm not going the route that I was accustomed to going and accustomed to seeing those results? It was actually Har Etzion, Gush Etzion, that is where I rekindled inspiration. But you see, it's a different type of inspiration because it's not the quick fix. You see, inspiration can be a little bit like drugs sometimes. It's easy, you take it, boom, like you get the high from the inspiration, but it's not something that it's not something that is that lasts. You have to constantly be going through inspiration to be able to keep that up. It's like almost like because it comes up and then it comes down and comes up and down. But when you take the Tanakh and you start to really decipher it, finding structure, keywords, intertextuality, understanding these texts talking to each other, and then understanding, this is why I brought up before, the enriching part is not just in seeing the unity of the text, but seeing how the text is informing each other and something really deep is coming out of all of this. It's not just, it's not just a literary exercise. It's a divine document. It's a divine text, which we are using certain tools given to us that we can then unlock it. For me, that gave tremendous inspiration. And it was, in a sense, more inspiring than anything I ever had before. So this whole conversation, this whole time, I'm kind of biting my lip because I get what you're saying. I understand, but arriving at a mature inspiration is 100 times more powerful, effective, lasting, and real
Well, I
than
thank you for the chizuk.
no, but I'm just telling you from my experience.
Hashem,
That's my experience.
Hashem is not found in the whirlwind. He's found in the still, steady voice.
Right.
Right. So
and yet we wouldn't outlaw NCSY Shabbatones for our teenagers. We understand that there's a role in
there's a place for that. I'm not disagreeing.
There's a place for tishes. There's a place for singing. Right. There's a place. We need to be able to find that balance, and that's why I said it. I didn't say that JJ was right or the critique is right. Okay. But I do say it's something that I wrestle with because I understand there's what's the famous midrash? You take the long path that's short or the short path that's long. And too many people take the short path that's long into the quick fix, the quick inspiration. But they're always the most popular speakers in yeshiva. Like this guy, they're the fun ones, right? And those of us who are actually teaching text and teaching young minds how to work through text seriously, with discipline, with repetition. Think this out. I'm not going to give it to you. It's harder, it's less popular, and I embrace that. But I'm aware of I don't get up in class and try to be Mr. Inspirational, Mr. TED Talks every time in front. I'm trying to do something different. And
so I actually think that I think we're underestimating the ability to turn these into vorts, because if you like, I personally love Aleph Beta.
Yeah, Aleph Beta has essentially
it's 10
done
minutes.
What you're saying.
It's basically 10 minutes, and the way my kids love it, and I don't think they get it. This kind of inspiration.
Have you ever seen Aleph Beta before?
I'm a subscribed member. I don't think Rabbi Foreman appreciates the brilliance of what the visual adds to our understanding of text, which I've been fighting in yeshiva for years. Please give me a bar core. You'll be the only one who uses it. I don't care. Please let me do this. The first time I ever taught with a smart board is in the Yeshiva Or Chaim in Toronto. I was a guest speaker for one class, and I got to move words around, and all of a sudden everybody's watching because we live in
engaging.
This is it's a separate issue that every Jewish educator deals with. We're people of the book in a world of smartphones, and we are having a very hard time competing nowadays.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, for me, I think that to me is like, I'm so inspired by my children. I think that's for me the biggest test. My children are young; they're under 12, and this is the one thing that they like. And you would think they need to hear these stories and midrashim and all that, but actually this is the pshat is so attractive to them because it's just the way it's weaved together. It's done in like 10-15 minute segments.
It's incredible.
And there's a punchline at the end of it. So I think that I think we have to give it a little bit more credit.
Yeah, and that's when it comes to children. And I think as we become adults, I think that really, like, for me, it's almost I'm dumbfounded in a way because, like, to me, and maybe it's just me, maybe I don't know, maybe it's just me, but like for me, I don't understand how anything can be more inspiring. When I go through stuff, but maybe it's just me, maybe it's the problems with me.
And there's nothing wrong with just being you or myself, because not everybody applies to Gush, and not everybody is going to apply here. And
right.
Yes,
we're different. Yeah,
we have Shivim Panim LaTorah, and it's big enough that it can encompass all of us. This Gush Derech, I recognize it's that third critique that it doesn't speak immediately to the inspirational side. It hits because it's something that we all wrestle with.
Of course.
But we do it anyways. So, what do we have? What are our goals in it? It's as we notice that we veered off. What are the goals in education? What are we trying to accomplish? Where is inspiration found? That very critique, started that off, and you have to give JJ credit.
I think I want to give him a little bit. I want to be a little bit more fair because it's coming back to me what he was talking about. In that segment, I think he was mentioning the fact that, let's say, for example, the genealogy of like the descendants of Esau, right? All that's listed. And from a kind of, from the Gush kind of method, let's just look at it that way. It's kind of like, what does this do? What do we do with this, right? But with Kabbalah, for example, you can decipher a lot of meaning from all of that. What seems to be kind of
Okay.
right. That's what he was talking about.
Yeah.
What we would do with the Gush method is actually Rabbi Leibtag's first class on Sefer Bereshit, for the record, which is that there's a clever usage of the word Toledot that appears 11 times in Sefer Bereshit. And Radak and Rashi have an argument whether Toledot means generations or the happenings. And Rabbi Leibtag has, in one of his first essays ever, lined up, here's the 11 appearances of the word Toledot. Notice who gets genealogies: Yishmael, Esav, Bnei Adam. Notice who gets stories: Toledot Yaakov, Toledot Yitzchak.
Right.
And he argues that the Toledot there are a literary marker to say this is the end of Esav's story. All he has are generations. When I get to the Toledot Yaakov, there's still more story to be told. He's still part of the covenant. He's still part of the breed. Yeah. So I do want to give at least the Gush,
Sure. Yeah. That's what I wanted to address. I think that was part of what he was saying. But again, I have to re-listen to it. It's been a while. And is there anything else you want to, kind of tie a bow around all of this about the Gush Tanakh method?
We've been talking about the Gush Tanakh method. I think we've spoken, I think, well and intelligently about it, and I don't think I have anything major to add right now. So
Thank you. That was really enjoyable and very necessary. So and JJ, we love JJ. So
yeah, JJ's the man. JJ's the man.
I'd like to get to speak to him one day. I'm sure we'd have one of these people would love to sit down with a nice meal in a nice restaurant and just talk for hours. So
yeah, he's fantastic.
We're gonna get into your book now, and for everyone, this is the book.
Okay.
Put it in the screen. All right. So Yoel, Ovadiah, Micah. So let's start with in your introduction, you speak about prophecy. What is prophecy? And I think this is a question that not enough people ask. Sometimes you can be in yeshiva for 20 years, and I feel like, have they ever asked themselves what exactly is a Navī? I don't know. So when I saw your introduction and how you went through a very detailed explanation of what a Navī is, I found it very refreshing, very educational. So I wanted to bring this out. What is the etymological meaning and functional role of a Navī? Additionally, how do we understand prophecies that appear to have gone unfulfilled?
Two great questions. I'm going to do them in order. The first one is, what is a Navī? So I want to start with the end. What the Navī is not is a prophet, meaning the Navī in Tanakh is not somebody who has a crystal ball and sees visions in the future. The only person I think who would fit into that category in the Tanakh would be, ironically, the one person that Chazal debated in Megillah Gimel is not a Navī, and that is Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who's read the visions of Daniel in the chapters 7 to 12, the esoteric and the goat fighting the ram and the charging each other, and the visions of the splits, the north against the south, and all these are, and to be fair, the second half of Zechariah as well. Okay, they would be what we colloquially understand as a prophet. But the first appearance of the word Navī is in Sefer Shemot, where Hashem tells Moshe, Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Renei nataticha Elohim al Paro, ve'Aaron achicha yeh neviecha. I have made you a lord, or in position of strength, over Paro, and Aaron will be your Navī. And Rashi understands immediately that this just simply means speaker. In modern Hebrew, in early Hebrew, we talk about speech. Nivim are, proverbs or phrases that come off. And he understands the root to be nun bet. A niv is somebody who speaks. He's a speaker. He's a spokesperson. And Ibn Ezra prefers an understanding of Nun Bet Aleph, which is to reveal that God has a message, and the Navi's job is to reveal his message. In Akkadian and etc., they talk about the word, the shorish Naba'ah or Nabo is speaker, somebody who announces. And I saw when you asked me to, I found in a just recently, because you asked the question, that there's also a possibility, if you remember that famous phrase, nuttering nabobs of negativism, the Spiro Agnew and the Nixon's vice president complained the media were nuttering nabobs. So each just the word nabob from the word navi comes from, this all this etymology, but all that have to do is just simply giving a message over. But they are people who God speaks to, and that is important for us. And therefore, you can have people who work within the court. David has a court Navi, God, and also Natan, and Shlomo has Ido, and everybody has their Navim that are present. And then you have people who really are outside the court. They're speaking directly to the people. I think that one of the distinguishing factors between Nevi'im, Rishonim, and Achronim, all the Nevi'im Achronim do not talk to kings directly. They're talking to the people. They're on the soapbox, whether it's Yirmiyahu standing up in the middle of the Mikdash in chapter 7 and chapter 26 in Yirmiyahu. Wherever they're giving their speeches, it appears that they're trying to speak to the people directly outside of the political framework that they used to be kept in. But they're spokespeople. And that leads to the question. So it almost avoids your question, how do prophecies not become fulfilled? If I'm not saying that they're predicting, that the goal is to predict, then that almost removes the question. The Rambam in Hilchot Yesodei Torah in Perek Yud Daled has a rule though, which is, and it's based on Pesukim in Yirmiyahu. If a Navi gives a prophecy of impending doom and it doesn't happen, that doesn't impinge on his status as a Navi. In fact, that makes him a very good one. Guess what? You got the job done. Congratulations. I've scared the people, or I caused the people to think, rethink, to return, to repent. A Navi who says something good is going to happen, that becomes more of a challenge if it doesn't happen, because that has to be true. God would never give a positive prophecy without reason. The most insightful article on this, and we'll give two examples. In chapter 11 of Yeshayahu, describes the birth of Mashiach. And it takes place after chapter 10 in Yeshayahu, which describes the Assyrian invasion of Yehudah, which takes place in 701 before the Common Era. Now, Mefarshim have two options. This Nevuah is completely separate from the chapter in front of it because it didn't happen. The Mashiach didn't come in 701 before the Common Era. Or the Mefarshim can say, no, this is not referring to Mashiach. This is referring to Chizkiyahu, and it's only describing him in terms of what the later Mashiach would look like. The Malbim comes and he says, every Nevuah is a suspended sentence. If you're deserving, it happens now. If it's not deserving, it's going to happen later. He writes his long discussion of this, meaning Chizkiyahu should have been Mashiach. And if for those who know Gemara, Sanhedrin, the Perek HaChelek, that's an echo to the famous Gemara. Had Chizkiyahu only sung Shira, had he only sung, he only brought out the guitar, he only brought out, bring out the band. Had he only done that properly, he only said Hallel properly, he would have been Mashiach. That, of course, is also based on the fact in chapter 12, it describes this Rina B'Kol Zimra, the singing that will occur when Mashiach comes. So that Gemara is actually also a Pirush, commentary on that section in Yeshayahu. But if Chizkiyahu should have been Mashiach, it doesn't happen. So the Malbim says, if it doesn't happen now, it will happen later. We just have to wait for the next. But that Nevuah never, positive nevuot will happen. It's just a question of
When?
We're very fortunate. We're not in the Rabbi Akiva mode where we only see the foxes coming out of the Beit HaMikdash in the famous Gemara in Makkah, where we only seen and we have to rely on our emunah. Well, if the foxes are going to come out, then things can only get better from here. And if Hashem, this promise came through, this promise came through. We're very fortunate. We live in a time where we see the land of Israel flourishing. We see so many good things happening. And I know life is difficult here. I'm not unaware of it. I have 5 boys the last one gets out of the army today. So having said that, I'm well aware of what's, that is challenging, but this is so much better than it was 80 years ago. Things are so much better. And we see prophecies now, the positive prophecies, the return, the rebuilding. I'm very passionate about that. And I think JJ mentioned this is part of the focus of Tanakh. Now it becomes a living document again, because you've had all these positive prophecies that have been sitting on the shelf for 2,000 years. And now you can open the book up again and say, got it. That line right there, that tree, kids playing in Jerusalem. There you go. Okay. And you just get excited again. And the Tanakh now speaks to us again.
It's funny because it's funny that you mentioned that example, because I always wonder when people who are like, let's say, anti-Zionists, they'll say, or the religious anti-Zionists will say, like, we're waiting for the Navī, we're waiting for Eliyahu Navī to come and to give us the land, or to give us the Beit HaMikdash or the Mashiach or whatever it is. And I'm like, we don't need another Navī to come back when there's a prophecy being fulfilled already. Like that prophecy
sitting on the shelf.
It's sitting on the shelf already. So now it finally happened. Why are you not acknowledging that? It's right there,
You have to ask somebody else. I've thought about. I cannot give a fair answer for the other side.
Right.
I do try always, but at this time,
it's hard.
It escapes me. I have to be into that. I cannot honestly.
Well, it's coming from a place where there's a lack of acceptance for the world as it is.
Yeah.
Meaning the era of Mashiach in their eyes is something that is so radically different from everyday life that it almost requires something drastic, because to synthesize a messianic world with the world today doesn't compute.
Right.
That's what's going on.
I think it's also in general how much. Let's not pretend that Medinat Yisrael is this wonderful bastion of overflowing, and it's very hard to reconcile the two. It's very hard to reconcile. Here's prophecies coming true before our very eyes, and the framework, the structure in which it's happening, is not what we understand the perfect form of government to be, and how things are supposed to be happening.
But when was it really? That's even in ancient Israel.
And that's precisely the question of not knowing the Nahum.
Exactly.
Yep. You have it. Do not tell me that I'm waiting for this idealized period,
Exactly. I think I'd argue this is the best period in the history of Israel. Even greater, like the most Torah learning, the safest, the most, obviously not necessarily in terms of peace, but just like the amount of success we've had in this short period of time is just unbelievable. It's just,
I'm thinking I'm maybe 5 years in the time of Yoshio. I'm trying to go through Tanakh.
Right, but they're short. They're short lived.
Very few periods in Tanakh that you could look and say.
Going through the list, and said that.
Right. Shlomo's reign is portrayed. It's fascinating. It's a separate discussion, but Shlomo's reign is portrayed for 2 chapters as this idyllic, and then in chapter 10 and 11 all comes crashing down, but he's making these entanglements, and he's marrying women, and he's getting gold, and he's got this big army, and like, wait a second, that's not what and it's that contrast between the ideal and the reality. I think that you mentioned, Venzi, is precisely the Tanakh is very nuanced when it does this. It's very clever. It tells you, here's the story. There are ideal things, and we have to appreciate them, and we also have to deal with the reality as they are in front of us. I'm giving a podcast now on Shoftim, and one of the challenges of Sefer Shoftim is that you read Shoftim, everybody's horrible, everybody's rotten. And it was quiet for 40 years. And it was quiet for 80 years. And it was quiet for 40 years. which means that for the most part, most of the narrative space is talking about 7, 8 years, and ignoring these long periods of, the Chinese have a saying, may you live in interesting times. But the Tanakh doesn't talk about the 40 years of quiet. I would be happy for 40 days of quiet. Give me 40 days of nothing happening.
I think not to piggyback on before, but I think also that sometimes a little bit too much inspiration can cause this kind of this idealism that you're I don't want to piggyback off before, but there's a cost to everything in a way. Even of course inspiration is so needed, but when we're if we're only focused on inspiration with yeshiva students, the problem is that there becomes a little bit of an enchanted Judaism, and that enchanted Judaism doesn't square well with sometimes reality.
And that comes back to our question of inspiration versus.
I didn't want to do it, but it just.
Why not?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Yep. Okay.
So we want to know if you can delve into the 3 key reasons that you've identified why modern readers struggle to connect with the writings of the prophets.
So let me ask a question first. Answer quickly. When's the last time you took a book of Nahum out and just read it plain?
Well, I just did it today.
You did it today. You took it Ovadiah. You went to Shir, you took it Ovadiah.
I can get Ovadiah.
Okay. Benzi?
Over the weekend, I did Eicha.
Eicha.
Or
Okay.
Tisha B'Av.
Before Tisha B'Av.
Yeah.
So we do have, of course, these calendarical, you have to read this now, feel the need. And we get into a brief understanding of Eicha. Dr. Ziegel's book is fascinating and amazing on it. You didn't say I couldn't plug other people's books. So
absolutely,
we'd love to have her on. We'd love to have her on.
We want to get all these great people.
So I think most people don't look at the books, as I said, as they're there and they respect them too much. But I think there are three issues that prevent people from even approaching the books. The first is a sense of relevance. Okay. I spoke in Toronto. I was privileged to speak in Toronto at the end of June, beginning of July, in several Batei Knesset. And I remember saying, okay, I have this book coming out. If I gave a shir entitled The Navy Yoel, 10 people would show up. If I give a shir entitled The Navy Yoel on October 7th, as it turned out, I was packing the place. Because we look for relevance in everything that we do. Why is this important to us? And I remember a friend said to me, this is what you have to write about. Yoel, Obadiah, Micah. And I responded to him, and this was only 2 months ago, Yoel describes an invasion of the land of Israel by opposing forces. Ovadiah describes betrayal of the Jewish people by people who are supposed to be their friends and allies. And Micah is adamant that these invasions are taking place because of a breakdown of the social cohesion among the people living there at the time. How is this not relevant?
Mirroring reality right now.
Very much the reality. So we don't see them as relevant, 1. 2, we don't know the history. Most people's Navi learning ends at Yoshua, Shoftim, maybe Shmuel. Very few people know, and I'm going to underline, bold, repeat that word, know the history of Sefer Malachim, where all these Navis spoke. And that's why in both of my books, both in Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and in Yoel, Ovadiah, Micah, I try to give the historical background. I spent 50 pages on what do you need to know before you even approach these. And so pulling the Nevi'im out of off the shelf without any historical background doesn't do justice to the Navi. It prevents us from understanding it. The person who would disagree with me was Nahum Leibowitz. Nahum Leibowitz had a famous saying in talking about the book of Yonah. You don't need to know when Yonah lived. Nineveh is in New York, the Tokyo. Okay? That was her phrase. You don't need to know the historical backgrounds for what the Nevi'im are doing. You compare, and I'll say this gently, most people who've read Nechama's works on the Nevi'im Achronim find that they're not at the same level of Rav Unterman and others, Nechama Unterman and others. They talk about they're not at the same level of her commentary on the Torah because she doesn't do this. She just, what does corruption mean? And we'll talk about to Micah. I'm going to ask that question again. What is the word? So your worship, what does worshiping idols mean? Don't worship idols. Idols are bad. But what does that mean? Why did people worship idols? What was the background? The idol worship in Yeshayahu is very different than the idol worship of Nahum, and we don't have that historical thing. So the first is we don't feel the relevant because we don't have the historical background. And C, most importantly, I asked you about what books of Nahum you've read. How many times have you taken off a good book of Shakespeare or Milton off the shelf?
Only when we had to in high school.
Only when we had to. Yeah. And it's almost inapproachable. The language is it's so remote to us. It's so far away. We don't even appreciate what they were trying to say anymore. And then you have to have teachers who have to teach you the language and try to teach you. You have to teach the language and then try to teach why this is somehow relevant. 2 years ago, I had a chavrusa with one of my students on Paradise Lost, which is, among other things, an interpretation of Gan Eden and how Milton portrays what happens in Gan Eden. And it was a fascinating, and as well as an understanding of the nature of evil and where does evil come from. Milton has his own Protestant viewpoint, but the point being, it took forever just to get through the lines of the poetry in order to get to, and then trying to understand them before we could make a parish an understanding of how he was understanding Sefer Bereshit. So when you're that removed, you're removed historically, you're removed from relevance, and you're removed from the language, not just the language, the literary tools, it's poetry, what poetic device is being used, then you have a very challenging task, which is what I was trying to build the bridge to make it easier for students and readers to understand.
Which actually leads in to what you did in the book was you provided a brief history of Israel and Yehudah, Yisrael and Yehudah, and you gave a pretty. I'm not sure you'll be able to. I mean, it's a lot to do it on a sec, but if you could just give the basic outline of that history and how you showed how this history opens up understanding the Nevi'im better.
So I'm going to start not from I start from the beginning of the divided monarchy when Yehudah and Israel split. I'm going to start with year 841. Okay, 841 BCE. There's a new king in Israel named Yehu. He's just overthrown the Achav dynasty, and in the south, at the same time, you have Atalia coming to power, and she's killing off the sons of Beit David. But then the one remaining son, the one who is spirited away, then reassumes the throne, and that's Yoash. And you have this 100-year period of stability between the northern and the southern kingdoms. The Tanakh describes that the northern kingdom was being picked on from the side by Aram, and the southern kingdom was slowly growing. But by the time you get to the year 750, these are the two most powerful kingdoms in the area. And it should have been the golden age. In fact, Ben Gurion once asked, if you could be any king in Tanakh, who would you be? And his response was, I want to be Uzziah. He's king for 52 years, but he built up the Negev, he strengthens it, there's no wars mentioned. He really is 52 years of stability. And when you have stability, you can grow. And archaeologically, we see signs of this. We see The pots are all become standard sizes, which means that they're now involved in trade. And we see pots before the 9th century beforehand, they're all handmade things that you store things in the house. But all of a sudden you have these large collections of pots that are exactly the same sizes, same weight, same measure. And you can see that we're engaged in trade. The country's getting richer. And here's the challenge. This is when Yeshayahu and Amos first appear. Should be at the height, the pinnacle of what we talked about, an idyllic age, right? 750 should be a great time to be alive, whether you're in the north or the south. And yet you have divisions, okay? And yet Jews find something to fight about. They're divided geographically. They're divided religiously. The north is still in their syncretic, we worship God through golden calves. They're not quite worshiping, it's not a pure monotheism. You see lots and lots of these small little idols throughout the northern part. You see very few from this point in time idols in the southern. They're discovered through archaeology. And most importantly, they're divided socially. There's a social gap that's growing that is going to threaten the very nature of the two kingdoms. And you can see it actually, again, through archaeology, which is fascinating. This is, we see houses in Samaria in the 9th century are all the same size. Houses in Samaria in the 8th century, you have some very big mansions and some very small hovels. And that shows a
social hierarchy.
You see this start to split. You also see it, and how much more so for the people in the country, as rich landowners and what we would call today multinational corporations take over, the means of production. And this is what the prophets describe. When we talk about nowadays we talk about, multinational corporations controlling so much. But the prophets are describing the same thing. You have a few rich landowners who have bought up all the fields, the Jeffersonian ideal, as it were, of everybody has an independent piece of land, which we see throughout the Torah emphasized, seems to have disappeared. And then at this point in time, the Assyrians show up. And this becomes, if you deal with the Assyrian threat correctly, you'll survive. If you don't deal with the Assyrian threat correctly, you're going to disappear. And I date all three of the Nevi'im to this period, but we'll talk about what's more important is how am I supposed to deal with this Assyrian threat? And unfortunately, both in the north and the south, in the north, they engage in this series of assassinations. Do we make peace with the Assyrians? Do we fight the Assyrians? Do we make peace with the Assyrians? Do we fight the Assyrians? Pekach gets replaced by Pekachia, gets replaced by Menachem, gets replaced by Shalom, gets replaced by Obadiah. I didn't do that in the right order, but you can see back and forth every couple of years. It's a very unstable situation, and the Assyrians come and they're picking off the northern kingdom until eventually they're exiled. In the south, the Assyrians really would have left the south alone. Yeshayahu talks about in chapters 7 and 8 and 9, the Assyrians would have left the south alone. But the northern kingdom threatens the southern kingdom and says, are you coming to fight with us? Yes or no? And the Southerners do something that they're not supposed to do. The king is Achaz. It's described in Divrei Yamim Chavchet. He doesn't go, instead of siding with the north, which is what the northerners want, or staying neutral, which is what Yeshayahu is begging him. There are 2 chapters of Yeshayahu which is saying, stay neutral, you'll be fine. The Assyrians will pass by us, we can survive. He brings the Assyrians in. He surrenders to the Assyrians. Says let's surrenders religiously, but also surrenders religiously. He brings an Assyrian altar into the Beit HaMikdash, begins the first person to do that. His son Chizkiyahu tries to clean up the situation, but then Chizkiyahu then says, well, if I can get rid of the Assyrians religiously, I can get rid of them politically. And he starts an ill-fated war against the Assyrians in 703 that leads to the near destruction of the community in 701. That's the history. But what makes our prophets special is they look and they say, this isn't bad politics. The external politics, if I had only signed this deal, if I'd only gone to war this way, if I'd only done this, are reflective of a deeper inner rot because of the social problems you've caused yourself. And that's precisely the point. Because if we're talking politics, I don't know that anybody could have withstood the Assyrians. The Assyrians are a tremendous empire. They're possibly the world's first real empire, because they expand from the Fertile Crescent eventually in 671, 663. They're 1,000 miles down the Nile. That's huge in the space of the ancient world when you're moving soldiers by foot, tens of thousands of soldiers by foot. To get that far, to that sort of control, politically you couldn't stop them, but that's not what we're supposed to be focused on. And it's that tension between the king and the prophet. The kings are worried about the politics, and the prophets are saying you're ignoring the more deeper issues, the social injustice, the judicial corruption, everything that the prophets are screaming about. But what I find inspiring about that is because if you solve those problems, the other problems go away. Okay, that really, if you do the small things that the Nevi'im ask, be just, be honest, pray sincerely, everything else disappears. And it's not an easy message to sell because everybody, as we talked about earlier, everyone wants that quick fix. So do I side with them or do I side with them? How do I put my armies? Tell me about it. And God is saying, those armies are built on the backs of farmers and the tremendous costs. You raise taxes to put an army out. These are the challenges that you're not dealing with. So all these prophets have these different messages. They're coming at it in different ways. By the way, is one other thing that's fascinating. 2 out of the 3 prophets, Yoel and Micah at least, are 2 of the 3 only successful prophets in Tanakh. One's got to give, we don't get many successful prophets in Tanakh. Okay, they generally, in your first book I wrote, the port Zephaniah, being a prophet is not a job for a nice Jewish boy. It's not a good, you wouldn't want your kid to be one. But they're successful, and that's one of the questions that I try to ask in each one of the discussions of each of the Nevi'im.
Excellent.
So now
that's your history, and that's what you have to know to just come back to what you said. Just to summarize, you have to know this history when you read these books, and because we don't have that background, I tried to do it in 10 minutes. I apologize if I went too long. The first section, it takes like 60 pages but you have to have the history and what's all the forces that are at play to understand what the Nevi'im are up against.
And we're hoping that the viewers will pick up the book and read it for themselves, God willing.
Okay.
So the prophet Yoel, we're going to get into this story. Why do you feel that this is particularly difficult to interpret? And what are the various opinions about when and where he prophesied? And what perspective does your book offer on the issue?
If I was to just go through the opinions quickly, Rashi says that he is the son of Shmuel Hanavi, and he's quoting a midrash in B'midbar Rabbah. And Radak says he takes place in the 8th century in the time of Yehoram or Yehoshaphat, and you have 15 different opinions. And I keep getting reminded of what something was a saying my teacher, Rabbi Yaakov Beasley, likes to repeat. I know of 15 reasons why Ruth is read on Shavuot. I only know one reason why we read Esther on Purim. But the idea being, when you get this multiplicity of opinions, it's really we don't know.
Yeah.
And then in chapter 1, he describes an invasion of locusts. And in chapter 2, he describes an invasion by an army. And again, the Mefarshim are divided. He's describing 2 invasions. An invasion by an army, which is the approach of the Abarbanel, for example, and the locusts are a metaphor for the invading army. Or, like modern scholars think, that the description of the army invading is only a metaphor for the locusts. So we don't know what the problem is. What makes Yoel fascinating is he spends half of his book describing the problem. He calls the people to tshuva. When that happens, the invader disappears, the land is restored, and then he spends 2 chapters discussing, I'm just doing this on one foot, a spiritual revival among the people, and ultimately the judgment day of all the nations, Yom Hashem that he describes. Okay, the day of the Lord is a prophetic phrase to describe this final judgment day. And the book ends very happily. And we don't get books that end too happy. We don't get happy endings in Tanakh too often. It's a wonderful thing. And I just want to suggest two lessons from Yoel that are, the first is that he doesn't mention sin. He's one of the few Nevi'im who doesn't say, you're doing wrong, you're not praying sincerely, Yeshayahu Chavtet, your social justice issues, Amos, all of Sefer Amos, your problems with your how you serve Hashem, your dishonor, your lack of loyalty, fidelity, Hosea. There's no sin mentioned. Yoel, I think, is trying to articulate a theology that says I don't automatically have to look to beat myself, to flagellate myself in order to approach Hashem. We don't always have to beat ourselves over the head every time something goes wrong. And it's a comment of the Ramban who says Yoel's different than the locusts in Egypt because Yoel's locusts happen. Locusts are a part of the world we live in. And just because you keep the Torah and developing this, just because you keep the Torah and mitzvot doesn't mean that automatically life will be
dandy,
idyllic and perfect and, circuses and candy canes. That's not the world we live in. And Yoel's described, and I developed this idea that what Yoel's trying to do is you don't have to be this. How do I deal with the world that I live in? We talked about this tension that exists between we have this idyllic world and this real world. You also not be the real world. There are locusts. Locusts will come into this world. If you live in the ancient Near East, this is a tremendous threat. Until recently, we didn't understand what locusts were and how they appeared. They were grasshoppers, but under the right level of humidity, the right temperature, they turn into these massive swarms. Nowadays, we have satellite tracking, and we can deal with them very early on in the formation of the horde. And Baruch Hashem, we live in a world that has these technological advances. But the first thing is that Yoel's, and what makes Yoel unique is he's successful, I think, because he doesn't focus on you're doing this wrong and you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. He says, we have a problem. Here's how we pray. Here's how we get together. And here's how we approach Hashem. And we are humble. And we know that Ulai Nachem, God, maybe God will forgive us. Maybe God won't. We don't come there. We know that there's a possibility this prayer will not work. And it's precisely that humility that allows him to be successful. I also think there's one other thing here, which is why then mention the Yom Hashem at the end of the story? Because Yoel views the invasion as the Yom Hashem at the beginning, and it becomes Yom Hashem at the end. But what Yoel is doing is we all have problems, right? Mm-hmm. But those problems are easier to deal with when we see them in the larger picture. What Yoel does is says this small invasion can be the opportunity to if he's viewed as part of the larger picture of redemption, of Geulah, then this small invasion that we're facing, which for the people who lived at the time was very large. If you're threatened with lack of food, and lack of substance, you're not concerned about anything else. But by writing the book the way it does, Yoel expands our vision and says, this is a small little bump, but it leads toward a greater future. And that helps people deal with the problem that they have now. It's a very uplifting and happy book. I enjoy Yoel. I enjoy reading Yoel very much. And it's for that reason I think he's thrown in as when we talk about the Haftarot for the Yom Noraim, we always throw in a couple verses from Yoel. Because Yoel's the model for how to do it right. That's Yoel.
After this podcast, one of the things I'm taking upon myself is getting more into Haftarot.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. Ovadiah. As an introduction, could you discuss the prophet Ovadiah? Why did he express such intense anger towards Edom? And what are the different scholarly views regarding the date of the book, its authorship, and its intended audience?
Obadiah is an attack on Edom that there's no question about. It actually is one of the few books where, or Nevi'im, where here's the punishment comes first, and let me tell you what he did wrong afterwards. It's almost like he can't wait to go against Edom. Ben, you mentioned you were to share when we were talking earlier before the podcast that once we say Edom, this creates in the Jewish ear echoes of Esau, right? We go back to the long history of the relationship between Esau and Yaakov, and that obviously colors our relationships with the country of Edom. We have Edom attacking us many times in Melachim, Divrei Yamim. We also have actually however, in Melachim Aleph and Yud Aleph, it describes how Yoav goes and almost wipes out the country of Edom, and rabbinic thought is furious with him. Okay, this is not acceptable. Similarly, in Divrei Yamim, Chafei, the king at the time, Amachia, takes 10,000 men of Edom and throws them off a cliff, to which the Midrash says, this is why Bnei Israel get galut. Straight out. Echa Rabbah. Why did Bnei Israel get galut? Because of the cruelty. But this all reflects this cycle of violence that exists between Bnei Israel and Edom. And it's not surprisingly that when we talk about Edom, Edom is attacked more times by Edom and Nevi'im than anyone else. Yechezkel has a whole list. Yeshua has a whole list of Nevuot Ha'amim, the prophecies against the nations, in scholarly terms, the oracles against the nations. And everybody gets their fair share of comeuppance, Yirmiyahu, but they then dedicate, and let me give another chapter to Edom. Okay, Yechezkel gives another chapter against Edom. Yeshua gives another chapter against Edom. What are these? They're a small little kingdom on the south, but rabbinic thought blew them up. And then once you say Edom is Christianity and the Roman Empire, then, well, there's no stopping how bad Edom can be. So there's two approaches, I think, to understanding our dislike of Edom. The one approach, which I adopt in the book, is that Edom becomes the symbol of betrayal, because we don't have to get along with everybody, but we always hope that we get along with our family. And we've already saw that in the parsha that we've read recently, we turn to the king of Edom. We're brothers. Remember, you should be helpful towards us. And Edom's behavior towards us doesn't just violate bond of shared humanity, it violates the bond of brotherhood, of family ties. Those should never be sundered. And so Ovadiah is like, how can you do this to your own brother? How can you do this to your own brother? And the crimes are actually, for the most part, you stood by. You didn't come to our help. You laughed while Jerusalem was being invaded. As a side point, most modern scholars assume that this is referring to the destruction of the Beit Mikdash in 586 by Bavel. And in fact, Tehillim, Kuf Lamed Zayin, the song, the part of Tehillim that we don't sing, if you remember, when we get to camp and we sing Al Narot Bavel, okay, the moving soon, we leave out the last 2-3 Zachor Hashem livnei Edom et Yerushalayim. Remember, Edom, when you said there, Aru Adisabah, tear it down, tear it down. So most scholars think this is Ovadiah lives at the time of the destruction of the Khurban. Most scholars, most Mefarshim, Rashi will place him earlier. Rashi places him as the student of Achav. It's rabbinic tradition. I have a guy named Ovadiah here. I have a guy named Ovadiah here as Achav's prime minister, his assistant, however you wish to define Ovadiah. This must be the same guy. This is rabbinic tradition. Again, when you have these 15 opinions, I go back to what we said about Yoel. When you have a lot of opinions, the other problem is, of course, how many times is Yerushalayim invaded in Tanakh? We always remember the last time, which is the destruction, but they were invaded, I think, 7-8 times in Malachim alone. So, and in fact, Divrei Yamim, I try to figure out where Ovadiah lives based on the clues given in the text. I place him again in the Sancheres in the year 733 when the Northern Kingdom sacks Jerusalem. Divrei Hayamim Chavchet describes how the Edomites would stand outside and slowly just pick off the travelers and from the side, which is very much similar to what's described in Obadiah. But Obadiah's first point is this is a betrayal of brotherly ties, and that's so much more painful. That's why we have this. Recently, I've begun to rethink my thinking. It's not in the book, and that is whenever Edom is mentioned in Tanakh, it appears several times in the Nevuah. It's always Edom first and the rest of the world second. I just saw this in Yeshayahu Lamed Daled. Okay, Hashem says he's upset with the nations of the world. Ki ketef Hashem al kol hagoyim. And I want you to fill in the blank. Ki ravta b'shamayim kirbi. I've lifted up my sword into heaven. B'shamayim hine al. What's the opposite of heaven? Shemayim and
earth.
Earth should be eretz or even adamah. But therefore, I'm going to bring my sword down on Edom.
Oh, interesting.
Well, it plays on Adamah, though. Edom.
That's exactly what Septuagint does. The Septuagint takes out Edom and it puts in Adamah because it assumes that must be what the text was.
Okay.
But he does this. Yeshayahu does this several times, and Ovadiah does it as well. He says, all of a sudden in verse 15, I'm now going to destroy all the nations of the world who stood against you. Like we were talking about Edom. When did the Edom become the nations of the world? So Edom and the nations of the world that stand against us become synonymous in prophetic literature, which implies that there seems to be a larger picture. And what it says, if my first read, if the combined two reads, is God is not going to take judgment. He's not going to render judgment only on the Irans and the Hezbollahs and the Hamases, but also all those people who stood by neutral and didn't help. Okay, that ultimately because if that's what Edom did, this is what God, and this God is not, God knows who the enemies are, but to paraphrase, another poet, the deepest depths of hell are reserved for those who maintain neutrality. That's Dante's line, right? For those who remain neutrality in a time of crisis. When you're asked to choose between what is really good and evil, you cannot sit on the side. That's not an option. And I think that's what Edom represents. It's a thought, but I'll let you read the book and come to, read Ovadiah. I may have read the book incorrectly, but I'm always open for discussion.
And it's it's the shortest book in Tanakh. So for all of you,
there's no excuses.
There's no excuse.
Okay.
At least on Parshat Vayishlach, because it's the Haftarah for Vayishlach as well. When we conclude with that list of kings of Edom, we then go straight into the Haftarah of Edom.
Very good. So the last part we want to get into is the prophet Micah.
Oh, my favorite.
What set him apart?
I'm not allowed to say that, but if you ask me what my favorite was, Micah is always my favorite of the Nevi'im and Tanakh. So,
so first of all, I want to know why, but also what set him apart? What set him apart from the other prophets, and how does his style and structure enhance our understanding of the book?
Micah's 7 short chapters. Again, these are all. He lives at the time when I date when the Northern Kingdom is still alive. It's on its last legs. And the challenge becomes, how do what lessons can we learn? What should we be learning from this? He's mentioned as being part of of kings, mentions the Northern King. It also mentions Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiyahu, which is just one king short of Yeshayahu, which means he's a little bit after Yeshayahu. And what he does is fascinating. He looks at the first chapter is a discussion of the invasion of the South. Like the Radak and the Malbim, I argue this is from the Northern Kingdom, and modern scholars try to date it to 701, but they have to do a little bit of violence to the text, because I think Samaria is still alive. The 733, the Northern Kingdom invades the Southern Kingdom. This is the worst, that civil war. Do we fight the Assyrians? Yes or no? They invade. And he describes the suffering that is caused to the people of the south. And then the question is, what lessons should I be learning from this? And he has 2 chapters dedicated to corruption, which I find fascinating. In the second chapter, he describes the corruption of the rich, people who are greedy, they lie on their beds, they take people, they buy up fields, they turn people into slaves. And it's so passionate, he describes his suffering. Micah is from Morashah, and Yeshayahu is from Yerushalayim. Morashah is a small farming community, and Yeshayahu is from the palace. He's, rabbinic thought he's actually a cousin to the kings. He's from the rabbinic. He's from the rabbinic. He's from David's family. Just one brother off. Had his brother been older, he would have been. Had his father been older, he would have been king and not a prophet. And Micah describes in such beautiful poetry, and also so many brilliant allusions to Sefer Yoshua and other places, what the effect of the greed of the people are. And then he comes back in chapter 3 and talks about corruption again. And I always like to ask, why do I need 2 chapters on this? Did you have and the difference is the corruption in people's hearts. People who have money, people are greedy. We all want more. That's human nature. But what gets Micah going is the corruption of an established, institutionalized corruption. And I love asking students, what does institutionalized corruption mean? And I say one line, and understand I teach 18-year-old young men. A society that says you have to go to university to make a living. And in order to make a living, you have to put yourself $200,000 in debt. What sort of society is that? That's an example of societal corruption. Okay, where the whole framework is rotten. Something is very wrong with it, and it's not the individuals anymore, but it's the people who make decisions and how they run the society. And Micah says perhaps some of the most famous lines at the end of the thing. Zion sadeh techaresh, Yerushalayim yin tiyeh. Zion will be plowed up like a field. Yerushalayim will just come as heaps. And it's such a powerful phrase that Yirmiyahu is going to quote it 100 years later in his own defense. How can you accuse me of blasphemy? Micah said Jerusalem would be destroyed too. And then what Micah does is brilliant. He takes chapter 4. And chapter 4 begins with lines we've heard before. Ki mitzion teitei Torah, devar Hashem Yerushalayim. Where have we heard that before? Every time we take out the Torah, obviously, but that's Yeshayahu. He takes the same verses as Yeshayahu does. But Yeshayahu puts it at the beginning of his Nevuah in chapter 2, when he's talking about Bnei Israel at their best. Which is we have the opportunity, says Yeshayahu. We can make Jerusalem the center of the world, the religious, moral, spiritual capital of the world. We have this opportunity. Let's not waste it because we're in such great shape right now. And what Micah's done, he's taken these same verses and placed them after his prophecy in chapter 3. And he says, the only way we're going to get to this is if we destroy what we have. I'm not saying that he's advocating the destruction, but he says the system is so corrupt, we need to tear everything down in order to rebuild, which is such a powerful, he's taking the same words, but they convey such different meaning in their context. It's really fascinating. Chapters 4 and 5 have a debate between him and the people, the nobles. Do we fight Assyria? Do we go out to war? The end of chapter 5, we read in Parshat Balak that Hashem will declare war against the enemies. What are the enemies? The militarization of the southern kingdom. I'll destroy your chariots, I'll destroy your fortresses, and I'll destroy your strongholds. And then I, Hashem, will go after your enemies. Which is he doesn't want. We're not supposed to be focusing on building up the military. We're supposed to be focusing on social justice. And he concludes with 2 chapters. The first chapter, everybody knows, even though they don't know it's from Micah, where this is why we read Micah and Balak. the people turn to Hashem and say, well, what do you want from us? More korbanot? We'll give more korbanot. We'll gladly give more korbanot, which is exactly what Bilam said. If we just keep paying God off with more korbanot, we will, God will answer our prayers. And they have become Bilam. And Micah, in fact, mentions, I brought you out of Egypt, and you didn't remember what Bilam did. And you keep asking the same questions. And Micah responds, what does God ask of man? Matov. Asot mishpat, avad chesed, vasnei lechet. Be just, love kindness, and walk humbly. I'm not asking for big checks. I'm asking for you to be Zayamensh. Please be good people. That's all God ever asks. And it's so powerful. And then in chapter 7, if you get a chance to read chapter 7 of Micah, please read it before Rosh Hashanah. I'll tell you why in a second. It's such a personal, he's walking through the destruction of what's left behind, that he feels like he's in a field where all the grapes are off except for these single grapes hanging on the, he's so lonely and there's nobody there who understands what he's been trying to do. But he then finishes again. I love books of happy endings. I'm a sucker for the old Hollywood, model. Hashem will come and tear down our enemies, and you'll understand why we say this before on Rosh Hashanah. Who is like God, who's going to forgive iniquity and protect and forgive the remnant of those who remain. He doesn't stay angry for his mercy. Is what we say on Tashlich, right? He will cover our compassions. He will throw it into the depths of the sea. Now, who's been thrown into the depths of the sea before? Again, let's play Gush Tanakh. Who's been thrown into the depths? Egyptians. And so immediately what a good person should do is take a look. Here's chapter 7 in Micah, and here's this Shirat Hayam. And you see Micah has taken verse after verse after verse in Shirat Hayam and put it here. But he does it for a purpose. When we, in Shirat Hayam, in Exodus and Shemot, who gets thrown into the sea?
The chariots of the army.
Our enemies, the Egyptians. So who's going to get thrown into the sea here? It's our own sins that get thrown into the sea. And if you appreciate that, what he's done with that, again, that conversation, which is such a beautiful Pogo, the American cartoon, we have seen the enemy and he is us. This is what the message of every Navy is. We're the ones who do this to ourselves. We have to work on and strengthen our efforts to build social cohesion and social justice and not tear ourselves apart. And then when that happens, nobody can attack us and nobody can hurt us. And we have to get that lesson through. I think that lesson still remains as relevant today as it did, 2,700 years ago. Absolutely. That's Micah. I have a love for Micah, passion for Micah. They're all wonderful, though, and I strongly encourage people. So when I asked, when's the last time you took a book out of Nahum out, that everybody should be able to give your answers. So
amazing.
This was unbelievable. Already one of my favorite episodes that we've done so far. So thank you. And we want to allow our audience to know where they can find you. And also, if there's anything you want to plug besides the book.
We've got a lot of work to do as a people. Obviously, you've talked about the Maggid series more than I have. There's so many great works of scholarship just coming out. I'm on Bazak's translation work on
just came out. I'm waiting for part 2 to come out.
Waiting for part 2.
I went through all of it during COVID, but the online version, because I could do the Hebrew. My Hebrew is good, but it just would take a lot longer. So I wanted to be able to.
I appreciate that. I do. Soon, Ed Shalom's books on Amos and Hosher come out. Everything is worthwhile. And anybody who wants to reach me, my working address, as it were, is ybeasley@levatorah.org. Anybody who has any questions. One of the heartening or heartbreaking things that you can decide is that I've received so many the Maggid influences, not only been within the Jewish world, but I've received letters from professors and a Christian. There's a Baptist college that wanted to use Nahum, wrote Koren, can we use Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah for our textbook, for teaching? And I'm like, on one hand, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, that's wonderful. That this is Zechariah Chet describes how every Jew will be grabbed by people, non-Jews, teaches Torah. But first, I want to hear that these books are being, textbooks, and we've put Nahum back into curriculum, which has always been my pet peeve and what I've dedicated my life to doing, making Treyasar great again. So
Tanakh has to be the Tanakh to really think as a Jew, the heart of a Jew, the heart of being Jewish. It's really all in Tanakh. That's where we that's if it's not that Gemara, Musar, all that's all beautiful and necessary and important and not in any way taking away. But at the end of the day, Tanakh is our heartbeat. That is.
I think you're correct. One of the things I noticed this year, I had a bit of a crash after Purim. I was 6 months of this, what's been going on, not just, my kids, the army, and the students, the army. And I went to a Hasidic rabbi for a consultation, a very close friend. And he said, why you're feeling the pain so much? Because you're a Tanakh person. And he said, the Tanakh is the heart. And this isn't saying it's the heart does not invalidate the importance of the brain, the kidneys, the liver, every other part. The whole Jewish body has to have everything, but we have to go back to the heart of what the ethics and the morals of what we believe and what we do and what we're trying to accomplish. We can't get it through. They're not, the other books are important. They're not a substitute for going back to the original source.
Worse.
Ben, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I just want to ask you, because this is a topic that's come up before, but before we go, how do we kind of, push people to bring the focus back to Tanakh? Because especially in America here, we like in yeshivas, there's not really a
bad situation.
It's almost ignored, unless some girls learn it, but that's about it.
It's so hard. I joke when I talk about Sefer Dvarim is there are two reasons why people don't. I ask, what does Rashi say on Shema? Okay, and I joke to my students, you don't know what Rashi says on Shema for two reasons. One, it's a summer parsha, and two, it's a summer parsha. And two, you've started learning Gemara already. And once you start learning Gemara, who has time for, these basic, for Dvarim, you get all these books get short shrift. We have so little time and so little energy. And there's a reality, it takes a lot more effort to learn how to learn Gemara properly than it might even. I talked about the difficulty of understanding Nahum, to teach young people, to give them the fluency in Gemara. Also, love is, as any parent knows, love is infinite, but energy is finite. You love all your kids equally, but your energy levels you have to learn to manage, and and the energy that we have to invest in if we want to raise literate generation. I wish we had them for all day. We don't, and so we have to pick and choose. But we do. Having said that, there's still no excuse for the lack of Tanakh that is present. We haven't yet figured it out. I think we're starting to. First, let's get teachers. And as more and more people read Maggid, they're able to teach. They're able to teach, and they can go into the class. And even if we don't get through all Treyasar, but at least they should start to know, and they should start to be aware, and then people will be inspired to open it up on their own and write books and argue with me. And I'm more than willing to. Those are the people I'd like the most.
You also you mentioned that when you're in college, you started out learning Gemara, but then you really you wanted something else. I feel like
I was not learning. Again, had I gone to a good Gemara shir, I don't know if this book would have. It's a strange.
The fact that the option was there to switch or to focus on something else, I think that should be available to. And it's difficult because obviously you have to have the teachers for it and everything. But yeah, I think that kids should have the choice also to, if they feel more inclined to study it, I think it should be made available. I just feel like it's not made available.
I think what you just did was go to Gemara and Avodah Zarah, Yotet. Ein adam lomed masha libo chafetz. And even at a high school level, we have to balance the need to create a sense of literacy, whether it's learning Gemara, whether it's learning Tanakh, whether it's learning Jewish history, Jewish law, and all these things that we have to talk about. Hashkafa, we haven't talked about, how many hours can we spend? But we do have to start giving them choices. The most effective summer learning program I ever was part of was IBA, the Israeli Basketball Association. This is in the 90s under Bobby Kaplan. I'm privileged to work with his son, Reb Mordechai Kaplan, now. And it was come into a base medrash, you have an hour, pick something off the shelf or learn with us. You have to choose, but you can't be passive. Creating that space for people to learn on their own, to study on their own, is what we have to be directing our energies towards. Because when you leave the structure, that's what you're going to do when you leave. A lot of guys leave yeshiva, they don't have the framework, they don't have the structure to tell them what to do, and they don't know what to do. They don't know how to take a book off the shelf and do it on their own.
You just said passive. So I've been thinking about this, and I think that part of the problem is that the way Tanakh is taught is passive. What I mean by that is, ironically, it shouldn't be this way, but ironically, this tendency to read Tanakh, and then it's almost like the second they read one verse, and I'm guilty of it my whole life, and I'm not excluding myself, but the second we read one pasuk, immediately to the commentaries, immediately to what does Ramban say? What is right?
But let's be honest, even the Chama, that approach was accepted by the Israeli high schools, and this was Nechama's approach, and she hated it because it was just memorized commentators as opposed to asking questions. Right? We need to be able to, we need to teaching active learning. Doesn't matter what you're doing. It's got to be active.
It's also the attitude gone into Tanakh. Tanakh is, in a sense, so revered. It's almost like, God forbid, chas v'chalila, that I would ever have anything to say, because it's Torah. Like, meaning like there's a reverence that's kind of working against people over here. In that reverence is kind of paralyzing them, because they're almost afraid to study it. It becomes more like, just tell me what I'm supposed to get out of here, because of the pedestal. And
that's interesting.
You get what I'm trying to say?
I do get what you're trying to say, and that's, of course, goes back to that conversation that Chacham Kimche, JJ, was talking about, the Tanakh B'Govei. I place it up here, and it's no longer accessible for anybody to. But the Gush Derech is to open this up,
open this up and
democratize. I'm going to go back to Rabbi Citron's phrase: democratize the study of Tanakh. You can do this. Is something you can open on your own, and
I think that that also needs to be emphasized. That's not in any way, God forbid, a lack of reverence. It's the opposite. It's showing a love and a reverence to the text, that you're willing to engage in it with everything, with every mental ability that you can. I think that this idea, the reverence that sort of, and I think partly it's also the way the Rabbanim are communicating this type of reverence, which kind of gives a little bit of a fear for people to really, really, really engage in it, and it becomes very commentary based, very take an idea, and chaval, because I think that you gain a deeper reverence, a deeper love.
I find it ironic that we encourage chidush and innovation in every other aspect of our studies. Do you have a chiddush? What do you learn? What do you have a chiddush? But we aren't allowed to do chidushim in Tanakh.
Although Rashi told the Rashbam that if he could do it over, he would write it up pshat of the chidushim pshat that come every single day in the streets. I don't have the exact quote, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, it's in the Rashbam and Lamed Zayin in Breshit, and I remember teaching Rashbam in a day school in Minnesota when we were in Shlichut many years ago, and the Rav was serious Rav. I mean, Rav Moshe Tuvi Alif is a serious man, he came up to me and said, I appreciate what you're doing. The kids are enjoying, but we aren't posik like the Rashbam. And it's interesting because at the time I didn't understand the statement, because how can you be posik? Either A happened or B happened. You can't give psak on what happened historically. You can't vote, But on a deeper level, many streams of orthodoxy have been slowly removing the Abarbanels and the Rashbams, and we talk about who's on your Mikra Gedolos page. There's only an apostate who put Ibn Ezra in, and for that we are
eternally grateful.
Eternally grateful. Whatever complaints we have against Yaakov ben Meir, at least he kept the Ibn Ezra alive. And so we have a very broad and wide range of thought available to us. As I cannot fathom or understand why somebody would wish to remove any of it, but I do understand how it becomes threatening, as you mentioned.
And we hope that I know that you're involved in a lot of works, and I know that you're going to bring out a lot more for everyone to. You're going to be a lot more material for everyone to read, a lot more books, a lot more publications. We wish you best of luck on all of those.
Thank you very much.
And
thank you very much for having me. This is just a conversation. It was only because JJ kept me up at night. I said I had to write you guys. I was just really shook me up, and this is great. Anytime we can spend an hour, 2 hours talking Torah, talking Tanakh, it's Baruch Hashem. Thank you very much, Ben and Ben.
Hopefully this gets you on his podcast.
Yeah, his own podcast, by the way. That would be great. Yeah, great. And we hope that you constantly inspire your students as you desire to do, and bring that happy medium.
The long but short path is what we always try to strive for.
Long short path. Shavua tov.
Shavua tov. Thank you very much.
Yeshach Kol.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much. Okay, all the best.
Bye bye.